Welcome to the Leading at the Next Level podcast with Dove Development Consulting, the show built to provide ongoing support for your leadership journey. Before we move into today's lesson, let's make sure we're on the same page. We've seen firsthand how much more is required to provide authentic leadership to a team than to simply manage based on the authority that comes with a position or title. What we've learned through more than 50 combined years of leadership responsibility is that taking the extra steps to serve people and earn influence will always produce results that barking orders never will. And if you'll stick with us through the end of the episode, we'll share how you can get a complimentary trial to a resource we've built that's like nothing else you've ever seen. With that in mind, let's get to work. We're going to continue down the path of the cost of poor communication, and we're going to look specifically this time at several areas in your business that are most definitely impacted by that poor communication. It seems that, the cost of poor communication, it's impacting enough organizations that it's become a hot topic. Just about anywhere you look, you can find different stuff, different articles and so on. I found a separate one on Inc.com called Costs of Poor Communication Reach $37 billion. Avoid disconnects by implementing these two things, that referenced the same study that I cited before. That talked about the average loss, $62.4 million per year to those 400 companies of 100,000 plus employees. But the Inc. article that I found, it went on to share one more piece of that study that I hadn't seen anywhere else before. This time it shared, this particular article showed from that study that companies with leaders who possess effective communication skills produced a 47% higher return to shareholders over a 5-year period. I need you to hear this here. That same study, the one that Inc. referenced as well, it showed that companies with leaders who possess effective communication skills produced a 47% higher return to shareholders over a 5-year period. Now, it's one thing in my mind to see stats point to how much profitability is being killed by issues like this, but seeing how organizations that do these things well are capturing that lost profit can give even those of us who have really struggled a glimmer of hope. Hey, if we can just fix this thing, we can capture it. Now, while I've seen how much of a role communication plays in really every working environment that I've been a part of, I've also seen how many other things are impacted by communication, for good and for bad. And it certainly doesn't only apply to the business world. Since I guess it was, late 2019, I've written a monthly column for a local newspaper, and it's been focused around the topic of effective communication. The biggest difference, though, is that column, and between that column and the majority of the work that we do, has been the focus on how communication builds or can tear down personal relationships just as much as it does business relationships. And really the profitability businesses need to remain stable. Now that column, again, that's tied more to personal, not as much business, but it correlates, right? And regardless of where we're doing the communication, the relationships involved become stronger or weaker based on the energy that we invest. If we're willing to invest energy into making stronger relationships, they're going to become stronger. If we're not willing to invest it, should we expect anything other than that relationship to become weaker? Now, good or bad, that communication serves as a fuel for quite a few other fires that we're going to be dealing with. Now, the goal, again, that I've had with that newspaper column has really been provided to provide a resource for the folks that read it locally, that really helps them enjoy better relationships with friends, family members, the people that they interact with most frequently. That said, the same tools that I share in that column apply at least as much in the business world, because the relationships that we build with the teams we lead have direct ties to the ever important profitability that we're looking at right here now. Now, when we've built strong relationships with our team and we communicate with them clearly on a consistent basis, we become likely candidates for experiencing this magical thing that I often hear folks in these fancy columns refer to as employee engagement or buy-in. Now, when I cover these two topics, those things specifically in a group setting, I typically use the analogy of a rowboat, and I explain that The actively engaged folks are usually the ones that you would consider they've got their oars in the water and they're rowing just as hard as they can to help the boat reach the destination. Unfortunately, the highest I've ever seen any employee engagement study show for these actively engaged folks has been just over 30%. Quite frankly, I don't believe that active employee engagement needs to top out there. And we'll work through the specifics of how we can address that specifically when we look at that particular profitability killer in more detail later on. For now, though, I challenge you to consider whether you've ever been completely bought in to an idea or as actively engaged as you were capable of being when the person leading the team had not invested the energy to communicate effectively with you. Now, here's a tip. I know the answer, and the answer is no, you weren't. But you can't be when you don't understand, when there's not clarity, there's no way we can buy into it. And if we do, we might be going really, really fast in the wrong direction. Poor communication can add quite a bit of fuel to the fire that's burning up our employee engagement and our buy-in, but it also creates confusion and that confusion kills quite a bit of profitability too. That's what I was saying there just before, is if we didn't have the clarity and we were working as hard as we could, that confusion might pull us farther away from profit than really capturing it, right? So communication, good or bad, doesn't just impact relationships and the buy-in and employee engagement tied directly to those relationships. It also fuels the fire when it comes to whether or not our team members are clear on what action they should be taking. When there's confusion, we can expect trouble to follow. It does somehow, some way, some shape, some form. Don't miss my point here, though. I'm not talking about the confusion that usually is followed. That usually followed nearly anything. If you've ever seen the show King of the Hill that was in the late 90s, kind of a quasi-adult cartoon, if you will, if there is such a thing. There was a character named Boomhauer, and he just had this mumble and slang talk that you're kind of like, what did he say? The kind of confusion I'm talking about here comes when we fall short of providing those team members with clear expectations that they can act on, that they can really drive forward and get the results that we're looking for. If we haven't spelled out, here's what we expect, can we really hope that they'll get the results? Now, think back to that SIS International research study statement that I shared, suggesting that a business with 100 employees spends an average downtime of 17 hours a week clarifying communication issues. If those numbers are even close to correct, more than $500,000 of profit is killed annually for companies that size. For perspective, let's say that one of those companies with 100 employees does around 20 million per year in revenue with a 10% profit margin. Now, let's be conservative and let's pretend that even the best communication only eliminates half of the downtime chalked up to the need for clarification. What links, I'll ask you, have you seen business owners or executives or managers or even supervisors go to for a 12.5% increase in overall profitability? And I'm going to say, gosh, I've seen them go through some pretty crazy lengths for far less than that. And if we can do that through communication, I'd say, my goodness, why aren't we? And sometimes I think it's because we don't understand how. Now, if we're having this discussion face to face, I would bet that we could share some crazy stories for hours. Since we're not, I'll keep it simple. And I'll say, again, running through walls mirrors what I've seen people do to capture even smaller increases in profit than that. But I want to be really honest here and say clear and consistent communication isn't too much to ask, right? That's just something we should be doing. Will it take time? Will it take energy? Absolutely, it's going to. But I can't imagine a scenario where that time comes close to that 17 hours per week of lost time, and the results our team can achieve with that will be remarkably better. Now, I've mentioned it a few other times as we've dealt with these profitability killers. It's really a matter of what result do we want for the work we do. So which one do we really want in the process? Now, when we're willing to set clear expectations for the results we need, as well as the behaviors that are required to achieve those results, and we're willing to share that message on a consistent basis, communication within our teams should be at a minimum. Now, for what it's worth, I really do believe we could cut the downtime hours by far more than half, but I'm going to save that debate for when we get to have the conversation in person. The beauty of minimizing the downtime that we lose by setting clear expectations and providing the clear and consistent message is that it spills over into one other key area, simply because we shouldn't be nearly as frustrated, and we shouldn't have to say, I just can't take it anymore ever again. Now, with that in mind, let's work through that before we really dive into some of the how-tos of dealing with this specific profitability killer. So again, consider that 17 hours of downtime due to clarifying communication issues that the SIS International Research Study cited as an average weekly cost for those companies. Again, it's an average. It's not a high, it's an average. After spending about 2 decades, just shy of 2 decades in a manufacturing environment, I tend to see just about everything through that lens in some way, shape, or form. To me, that downtime represents time that couldn't be attributed to anything else. It was specific because of poor communication, not because of a bad setup, not because of this, not because of that. For instance, the facility that I worked in, we had special work order numbers, commonly referred to in that particular organization as H numbers, that were usually generated to capture the time for miscellaneous issues that fell outside of the normal production process. So for instance, when we had a special project, an H number was assigned to it. If we had a group of big shots coming in from corporate or wherever, we generally had an H number to charge all the extra cleanup time to. In fact, we had one young man who became so proficient in using those H numbers to write off his unproductive time, and trust me, he had a bunch of it, he earned the nickname of H John, and we jokingly, not so jokingly, said, well, only one of the H's were silent, because the first H in H John was very prevalent in his time card on a daily basis. It was pretty wild. Now, that 17 hours of downtime, it certainly doesn't represent the entire time there was no direct labor. To me, this is the time outside of expected indirect labor where production could have and should have been, but wasn't due to the need that wasn't due to the need for additional clarification. So again, it's not the setup, it's not this, it's not that. It's when, hey, we didn't understand it. We had misunderstandings that led to not being able to be productive. Now, I believe communication needs to be nearly consistent, even during the production process. So it's certainly not saying that we're not going to have communication time won't happen, but we need to do it consistently. That 17 hours represents time lost because the initial communication wasn't clear. Now, here's where I'm going to challenge you to remember that this was average. I said this earlier, it was the average time. It wasn't the high. Just think how much worse this could be for those that are well below average, that have much worse communication. And now think about how frustrated the folks in the supervisory management roles tend to get in those situations where they've had to repeat instructions over and over and over again, watching that downtime mount up because you know they're measured on it, right? All too often, I've seen this be where a supervisor or manager just blows their top, but it rarely happens right away. The scenario I've seen more than anything else over the last 25 years has been where the boss tells one of their team members, here's what you need to do. Then they repeat it a few times throughout the process, and they might even correct a thing or two. But they finally get something that resembles the result they need. It's done. The supervisor's aggravated, but he doesn't want to lose any more time by addressing the issue with their employee, so they go on with it. Now, this cycle tends to repeat a couple more times with no formal discussion, nothing ever being really addressed formally. It's certainly not put on paper before that the supervisor storms into the HR manager or maybe the owner of the company's office yelling, I just can't take it anymore. They won't do anything I tell them. We need to fire them. You've seen it too. Now, haven't been that HR manager and haven't been in several owners' offices when this has happened, the common theme has been that the issues leading up to this point have almost never been documented, and they've rarely been addressed head on. It's just been generalities, and the communication still isn't clear, with the employee in question. So they still don't, that employee doesn't really know it's coming. They're missing so much of here's what they could really do. Now, let's not even consider how little engagement a situation like that could ever build, right? Gosh, if you're not willing to be clear and help the person understand what you need, can they really be engaged? And let's not bother factoring in the downtime that occurred leading up to the point. How many times have we said it over and over and over? What I do want you to consider is how something like this leads to turnover, be that through the employee being terminated or just getting fed up and quitting on their own. We've all seen that happen, right? Now consider how it impacts everybody that's watching it. Because do you think there's any chance that the folks in the immediate area watching it go on, that they're going to be very, very engaged? Do you think they're going to feel like we're taking the best care of that other employee that we can if we're not giving them clarity, we're not answering questions, and when we're frustrated over time, we blow our top? And the answer is no. Now, when we've got all that mess going on, I'll bet you there are very few of our employees, even the best ones, who are going to be inviting their friends to work with them, right? And our recruiting process, which we'll look at soon, takes a hit as well. Now, notice that I didn't suggest that the supervisor had been communicating effectively with that employee. And because, gosh, telling somebody what needs to be done and them understanding it are two very different things. Now, think back to that whole George Bernard Shaw thing that I said earlier about the single biggest problem with communication being the illusion that it's taken place. And here's the thing, I'm not suggesting that any of this is always the supervisor's fault. In more cases that I can count, this is boiled down to not having access to the right tools. So that's exactly what we're going to tie this all together with as we wrap up this look at this specific profitability killer on poor communication.
Thanks for listening to the Leading at the Next Level podcast. Next time, we'll pick up where we left off by digging into how breaking the golden rule can help capture some of the cost of poor communication. If you'd like to go deeper into anything we've shared here, or you need continuing education credits for your professional credential, send us an email at admin@dove-development.net, and we'll be happy to hook you up with a 45-day all-access trial to our complete Leading at the Next Level program at no cost. The full program includes access to well over 100 hours of digital lessons, complete with slides and action-based assessments to help you capture measurable bottom line improvements in your organization, and 2 live lessons each month with Q&A, so we can help you identify the specific action you want to take to lead your team more effectively.